I caught my husband and my boss together in my own house. What I did left Nigeria talking. The moment Obiageli walked through her own front door that Tuesday afternoon, something in the air felt wrong. Not the kind of wrong you can name, the kind that settles in your chest like a stone before your brain even catches up. She had come home early. Her boss had cancelled their afternoon meeting without warning. No explanation, just a short text. Something came up, rescheduled for Thursday. She had laughed about it on the drive home, thinking she'd surprise her husband Chukwuemeka with lunch. Maybe they'd sit together on the veranda the way they used to, before everything got complicated. She never made it to the veranda. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this one don't come twice, and you do not want to miss what happens next. This is a story about betrayal, about secrets layered inside secrets, and about a woman who discovered that the two people she trusted most in this world were playing a game she didn't even know existed. Stay with me. Every single detail matters. Obiageli Nwosu was 34 years old, born in Nnewi, raised in Lagos, and currently living in a modest but beautiful home in the GRA area of Port Harcourt with her husband of 6 years, Chukwuemeka Nwosu. She was the kind of woman people described as composed, elegant without trying. She wore her confidence the way some women wear perfume. You didn't always see it, but you always felt it when she walked into a room. She worked as a senior marketing associate at Meridian Consulting, a mid-sized firm that had been climbing steadily in the Port Harcourt business world. Her boss, the managing director of the firm, was a man named Tobena Okafor. Mid-40s, sharp dresser, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and always said the right thing at the right time. Obi, that's what everyone called Obiageli, had worked for Tobena for 3 years. He had championed her promotion. He had written her a glowing letter of recommendation when she applied for a prestigious marketing fellowship. He had sat across from her at countless meetings, praised her work in front of the entire office, and treated her with what she believed was genuine professional respect. Chukwuemeka was an engineer, quiet, dependable, the kind of man who fixed things. Not just in the house, he fixed situations. He was the calm in every storm. When Obi's mother had her surgery 2 years ago and the hospital bills were crushing, it was Chukwuemeka who quietly rearranged their finances without making her feel like a burden. When her younger sister's marriage was falling apart, it was Chukwuemeka who sat with her for hours talking through solutions. He was steady. He was loyal. Or so she thought. They were still trying, still believing. At least that's what she thought they were doing, together. The front gate was open when she got back. That was the first thing. She always locked it when she left in the morning, and Chukwuemeka never came home before 6. Never. His office was on the opposite end of the city, and traffic on that road was legendary. The kind of traffic that turned 40 minutes into 2.5 hours on a bad day. It was barely 2 in the afternoon, so why was the gate open? She sat in her car for a moment, telling herself she had probably just forgotten to lock it. She was distracted that morning. She'd had an early call with a client in Abuja, and she'd rushed out. It was possible. She packed. She gathered her bag. She walked to the front door. The door was also unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, not dramatically, not with suspicion, just the small, careful movement of someone who notices things. The living room was exactly as she'd left it. The cushions arranged the way she liked, her orchids on the windowsill, the television off, everything normal. And then she heard it. A sound from upstairs, soft, low, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in an empty house. Later, she will tell people that she didn't run, she didn't freeze, she didn't scream, she just walked. She said it was as if her legs already knew what her heart was not yet ready to accept, and they carried her up the stairs with the calm precision of someone walking towards the inevitable. She stopped at the bedroom door.
It was slightly ajar. Through the crack, she saw them. Chukwuemeka, her husband, sitting on the edge of their bed, leaning forward, forearms on his knees, his face turned towards the other person in the room, a posture she recognized. Intimate, familiar, the kind of closeness that doesn't come from a single day. And the other person, Tobena Okafor, her boss. They were dressed. That was the first thing her mind registered. They were not in the middle of anything physical. They were talking. But the way they were talking, the low, urgent, barely above a whisper intensity of it, was somehow worse. It was the voice of a conversation that had been happening for a long time. It was the voice of people who knew each other in ways that had nothing to do with her. She stood there for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds that felt like 30 years. Then she stepped back from the door. She did not push it open. She did not announce herself. She did not scream or throw anything. Instead, Obiageli Nwosu turned around, walked back down the stairs, walked through her living room, walked out of her front door, got in her car, and drove away. And what she did next is the part that left Nigeria talking.
She drove to her friend Ngozi Chukwuka's house. Ngozi, they had been friends since secondary school. The kind of friendship that survives distance and silence and the years that change people. Ngozi was currently between jobs and was home when Obi arrived, unannounced, still wearing her office clothes, standing at the door with an expression Ngozi would later describe as the face of someone who has just stepped off a cliff and hasn't hit the ground yet. Obi sat down. She didn't cry. She told Ngozi exactly what she had seen. Ngozi's first reaction was to grab her phone. "Let me call Chukwuemeka right now." "No." Obi's voice was quiet but absolute. "Don't call anyone. Don't tell anyone. Not yet." Ngozi looked at her. "Obi, did you hear yourself? Your husband and your boss were in your house." "I know what I saw." "Then what are we doing? Why are we sitting here? Why aren't you—" "Because I need to understand it first." Obi looked at her friend. "There's something I don't know yet. I can feel it. Whatever this is, it's bigger than what I saw. I need to know everything before I do anything." Ngozi was quiet for a long moment. She knew Obi. She knew this tone. She sat back and said, "Okay, tell me what you need." "I need to think." So they sat, and Obi thought. She began with the facts she knew. 1. Tobena and Chukwuemeka had never been introduced to each other. Not by her. She had never brought Chukwuemeka to an office event. She had never mentioned Tobena at home beyond the professional context. There was no bridge between those two worlds. No reason they should know each other. 2. Tobena had cancelled their afternoon meeting without warning, which meant he had known he would be at her house at that time, which meant the meeting cancellation was deliberate. He had created an opening. 3. Chukwuemeka was home in the middle of a workday, which he never was, and the gate was open. He had been expecting someone. So this wasn't accidental, this wasn't a coincidence. They had arranged it. They had arranged to be in her house, in her bedroom, when she was supposed to be at work. The question was why? And here is where Obiageli's mind went somewhere that no one expected. Because most people faced with this evidence would have assumed the most obvious answer, would have assumed betrayal of the most direct kind, would have burst through that door and started screaming. But Obi had noticed something else in those 3 seconds at the door. Something small, something that her mind had registered but that she hadn't consciously processed until now. Chukwuemeka's hands. He had been clasping them together, tightly, the knuckles slightly white. It was a gesture she knew. It was the gesture he made when he was afraid, not guilty, not caught, afraid. And Tobena had been leaning toward him, not the way a lover leans, the way a man leans when he is in control of a situation and he knows it. Obi sat in Ngozi's living room and said very quietly, "I don't think they're having an affair." Ngozi stared at her. "What?" "I think Tobena has something on Chukwuemeka. I think he's been using it."
the room went silent. Using it how? Ngozi asked. Obi shook her head slowly. That's what I need to find out. She went home that evening at the usual time, acted as if nothing had happened, cooked, they ate together. She watched Chukwemeka carefully over the rim of her glass of water, looking for the signs she had spent years learning to read. The slight tension in his jaw, the way he laughed fraction too quickly at things that were not funny, the careful way he avoided her eyes when he was hiding something. They were all there, all of them. But she said nothing. That night, she lay beside him and stared at the ceiling while he slept, and she made a plan. Over the next 2 weeks, Obi moved with the patience and precision of someone defusing a bomb. She started paying attention to Chukwemeka's phone, not obsessively, just carefully. She noticed that he received calls late at night, stepped out to take them. She noticed that money was moving from their joint account in small, regular amounts, not large enough to be immediately alarming, but consistent enough to form a pattern once you were looking. She also, and this is the part that took the most courage, started quietly asking questions among her colleagues, not about Tobena personally, about the company, about the accounts, about where the money moved. She was senior enough in marketing to access certain client files, and what she began to find there made her sit very still at her desk on a Thursday afternoon and call Ngozi from the bathroom. There's money missing, she said, from a client account, a government contract account. Someone has been redirecting funds, small portions, over a long time. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd never see it.
And you think it's Tobena? Ngozi asked. I think it's more complicated than that. She needed to understand Chukwemeka's role. That was the missing piece. And as much as every instinct in her was screaming at her to confront him, to shake him and demand answers, she held herself back because she knew Chukwemeka. She knew that if she came to him with accusations, he would shut down. He would protect her, ironically, by keeping her out. He would carry whatever weight he was carrying alone, the way he always had, and she would never get the full truth. So she tried a different approach. She left a note in his briefcase. Not a confrontational note, not an accusatory note. Just 6 words written in her handwriting on a small piece of paper. I know you're in trouble. Talk. She told Ngozi later that she spent the entire next day terrified. What if he didn't find it? What if he found it and panicked? What if... He came home that evening and walked straight to where she was sitting in the kitchen, still in his office clothes, and he sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and he put both his hands flat on the surface between them, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was relief. Pure, exhausted, terrible relief. And then he told her everything. It had started 18 months ago. He had made a mistake at work, a significant one, not fraud, not intentional wrongdoing, but a professional error that had cost his company money, and that if reported would have ended his career and potentially led to criminal charges given the nature of the contract he'd been working on. He had been desperate. He had made the mistake of confiding in an acquaintance, someone he thought he could trust. That acquaintance had connections to Tobena Okafor. And Tobena, it turned out, collected people's secrets the way other men collected property. Within weeks, Chukwemeka had received a visit, a very polite, very friendly, very clear visit. Tobena had laid out the situation with the smooth ease of a man who had done this before. He was not going to report Chukwemeka. He was not going to say anything. All he needed in return was certain information, small things, details about Obi's work, her schedules, her client interactions, the things she mentioned at home about her office, and occasionally the use of certain facilities, including, when necessary, their home. Chukwemeka had been paying this debt for over a year, in money, in information, in silence. He was using you, Obi said, her voice very flat. He was using me at work and he was using you at home, and between the two of you he had everything he needed. Obi? He had me championing his projects from the inside without knowing it. I brought in 3 major clients this year. All of them went through his special account. She paused.
He built me up so I'd be more valuable to him. My promotion, my reputation, that was him investing. I was a tool. The silence in that kitchen was immense. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked. "Because he told me," Chukwemeka's voice broke. "He said if I told you, he would make sure you lost your job. He said he had enough influence in the industry that you'd never work in marketing in this city again. He said he threatened my career to keep you quiet." Yes, she was quiet for a long time. And then she said something that surprised even Ngozi later when she heard it. She said, "He made one mistake." Chukwemeka looked at her. "He underestimated me," Obi said. "He thought I was an asset. He never considered that I could be a threat." Now, here is where you need to subscribe if you haven't already, because what this woman did next is not what you think, it is not what anyone thought. Most people hearing this story expected rage, expected a dramatic confrontation, expected tears and screaming and things thrown across rooms. That would have been human, that would have been understandable. But Obiageli Nwosu had spent 2 weeks thinking, and in those 2 weeks, she had understood something that changed everything. She had proof. Not just suspicion, actual documented proof. The financial irregularities she had found in the client accounts, the pattern of money transfers, the professional timeline that could be reconstructed to show exactly how Tobena was routing funds through accounts she had been unknowingly attached to. She had also very quietly made copies of every relevant document and sent it to a secure location that had nothing to do with her work devices. And she had something else. She had Chukwemeka's testimony, the full timeline, the dates of every meeting, every demand, every exchange. She had asked him to write it all down, every detail he could remember, and he had spent 3 nights filling a notebook she had bought specifically for this purpose. She had, essentially, built a case. But she didn't go to the police. Not yet. First, she went to HR. Not at Meridian Consulting. That would have been pointless. Tobena ran that company. HR answered to him. No. She went somewhere else entirely. She went to the regulatory body that oversaw consulting firms in Rivers State, a body that had the authority to investigate financial misconduct and, crucially, to freeze the assets of a company under investigation while it conducted its review. She submitted everything. The documents, the analysis, a detailed written account. She signed her name to all of it. Then she went home and waited. 3 days later, investigators arrived at Meridian Consulting's offices.
What followed was not immediate. These things never are. But the structure of it was clean. Tobena was questioned. His accounts were reviewed. The client funds were traced. The pattern that Obi had identified was confirmed and expanded upon by people with far more authority and resources than she had. Within 6 weeks, Tobena Okafor was suspended pending a full investigation. Within 3 months, charges were filed. He called her once during that period, just once. She picked up the phone on the 3rd ring. He started speaking, something about misunderstandings, about how she had gotten this wrong, about how he had always supported her, always believed in her. She said, "I know exactly what you believed. You believed I would never figure it out. That's the only thing you got wrong." Then she hung up. But here is the part of this story that people in Port Harcourt passed around like currency. The detail that made this story travel, because every betrayal story has a turning point, a moment where the audience leans forward, and this was that moment. During the investigation, it emerged that Tobena had been running this scheme not just with Chukwemeka, but with multiple individuals. There were 4 other people he had compromised in similar ways. 4 other people who were simultaneously terrified and relieved when the investigation began. 4 people who had been carrying their secret alone for months or years, convinced that silence was their only option. Obi had not known this. She had not set out to rescue anyone. She had set out to protect herself and her husband and to dismantle the grip of a man who had used her trust as a weapon. But the investigation she triggered exposed every thread of Tobena's network,
and every person in it was given the opportunity to come forward. All 4 of them did. At the investigative hearing, when the cases were compiled, the lead investigator made a comment that was later repeated widely. He said that the entire investigation had been made possible by a single submission, a single person who had connected the dots and decided that silence was not the only option. That person's name was on the submission: Obiageli Nwosu. The company was restructured. The board brought in new management. Obi was asked in the reorganized Meridian Consulting whether she would consider taking on a senior role. She declined politely. She had already made a different decision. She resigned. Not in anger, in clarity. She had spent 3 years building something that never truly belonged to her. It had been built on a foundation that Tobena had carefully constructed to serve his own purposes, and even if the company survived and improved, she could not separate the professional life she had had there from the knowledge of what it had really been. She needed to start fresh. She did. Within 4 months of resigning, she had launched a small independent consulting practice from the study in her GRA home. 2 clients in the first month, 5 by the third. Referrals from people who had heard her name through the investigation, through the industry, through the quiet, informal networks that move faster than any formal announcement. She was good at her work. That had always been true, regardless of the context. The difference now was that it was entirely hers. And what about Chukwuemeka? This is the question people always ask, because the story when it first began circulating made people assume the marriage was over, that there would be no coming back from what he had done. The year of silence, the information shared, the house used without her knowledge, the fundamental breach of trust at the center of it all. But things are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. Obi had sat with this question for weeks. Not whether she was angry, she was. Not whether she felt betrayed, she did. But whether she believed him. Whether the man who had held her hand through her mother's surgery and sat with her sister through her failing marriage and quietly rearranged their finances to protect her from worry, whether that man was a good man or whether he was a good man who made a terrible choice when he was frightened and then spent a year trapped in the consequences of it. She thought about the note she had left in his briefcase, the 6 words, and the look on his face when he came home that night. Relief. He had been waiting for a way out. He had been carrying it alone because he was trying to protect her, even as he was, in the most complicated way, also betraying her. Both things were true simultaneously, and Obi, who was a woman who could hold complexity without needing to flatten it into something simpler, had to decide what to do with both truths at once. She told Ngozi, "If I leave him, I am leaving a man who made a terrible mistake and spent 18 months paying for it in silence. If I stay, I am staying with a man who kept something enormous from me and who let another man use our home and use our life without telling me. Both of those things are true. The question is not which one wins. The question is what I want." What she wanted, she decided, was honesty. Total, unconditional, nothing held back honesty. Not the performance of it, the real thing. And she put that on the table between them in that same kitchen, at that same table, and told him exactly what staying would require. He agreed to every term. He also, on his own initiative, contacted a professional counselor, not because she asked him to, because he said he needed to understand how he had allowed himself to be compromised so completely, to identify the fear and the silence in himself that had made him vulnerable to a man like Tobena in the first place. He said he never wanted to be in that position again, not the external position, but the internal one, the place inside himself where he chose silence over trust. That, Obi said later, was what made her decide to stay. Not the gesture, not the counseling, the fact that he had identified the right problem, that he understood it wasn't just about what Tobena had done, it was about the door that Chukwuemeka had left open inside himself, and he was going to close it.
There is a thing that happens in Nigeria when a story captures a certain truth. It moves. It moves through WhatsApp groups and through church fellowships and through office break rooms and through the long phone calls women have with their sisters when they are trying to make sense of something. It moves because it is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about a particular kind of intelligence, the intelligence of a woman who refused to react before she understood, who turned her grief into strategy without losing her humanity in the process. People talked about Obiageli Nwosu for months. They talked about the 2 weeks she spent watching and thinking rather than confronting. They talked about the regulatory submission. They talked about the 6-word note in the briefcase. They argued heatedly about the marriage, whether she should have left, whether staying was strength or weakness, whether trust could ever be rebuilt after what Chukwuemeka had done. The argument went in circles the way arguments about human behavior always do, because there is no single correct answer, only the answer that is right for the specific people involved. What was not debated was this. Tobena Okafor had spent years believing that his greatest advantage was knowing things other people didn't, that information was power, and that he had accumulated enough to make himself untouchable. He had been wrong about the most fundamental thing. He had believed that Obiageli's value was only in what she produced, the clients she brought in, the intelligence she unwittingly provided, the professional cover her good name gave to his accounts. He had never once considered that she might turn around and look back at him, that the same intelligence that made her valuable to him could be turned in the opposite direction. He had, as she said, underestimated her, and that was the only mistake that mattered. A year after the investigation concluded, Obi gave a short talk at a women's professional network event in Port Harcourt. She was not a public figure. She had not sought attention from this story, but a friend of a friend had connected her with the organizer, and she had agreed because the topic was workplace safety and because she had something to say. She spoke for about 15 minutes. She talked about the importance of documentation, about the difference between reacting and responding, about the loneliness of carrying knowledge that you are not yet ready to use. She talked about the moment at the door, standing there, looking through the crack and choosing not to bust through it. She said it was the most important decision she had ever made, not because restraint is always the right answer, but because in that moment, restraint gave her information, and information gave her power. She also said something that nobody expected. She said she was grateful. Not for the betrayal, not for the year of manipulation and the way her professional achievements had been used against her without her knowledge. She was not grateful for any of that, but she was grateful for who she had discovered herself to be on the other side of it. She said she had not known before all of this how much she was capable of. She had believed herself competent, confident, capable in normal circumstances. She had not known what she was made of when the circumstances were not normal. Now she knew. She closed by saying, "The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. They show you exactly where your power is invisible to them. That is where you go to work." The room was silent for a moment after she finished. Then the applause began. There is still one thing that hasn't been explained. One small detail from that afternoon in the hallway, standing at the bedroom door. Obi had said she was there for 3 seconds. She had seen Chukwuemeka's hands, white-knuckled and clasped. She had seen Tobena's posture, the forward lean, the control. She had turned and walked away. But there was a moment in those 3 seconds before any of that processing had happened, before she had identified the body language or read the power dynamics. There was a pure, unmediated instant when she saw the two of them and felt something. She described it once to Ngozi late at night, after they had finished a bottle of palm wine on the veranda and the city had gone quiet around them. She said she felt sad. Not angry, not betrayed, not even shocked really. She felt sad. A deep, clear, uncomplicated sadness for the fact that two people she had trusted were in her bedroom together, and she was standing outside the door, and the world she thought she lived in was not the world she actually lived in. And then what? Ngozi asked. And then I thought, okay, if that's the world, then let me understand it. Let me understand all of it, and then let me decide what to do. Ngozi was quiet for a moment. That's not normal, you know. Most people would have gone to pieces. Obi sipped her palm wine. I went to pieces later in the car. I drove around for 40 minutes and I cried so hard that I had to pull over twice. She paused, but I made sure I understood everything first. The thing about this story, the reason it traveled, the reason people are still talking about it, is not the betrayal itself. Stories of betrayal are everywhere. They are not rare. They are tragically among the most common human experiences there are. What made this story different was the woman at the center of it, the specific quality of her response, the refusal to be diminished even in the moment of discovering that she had been deceived, the intelligence to separate what she felt from what she needed to know, the courage to act on what she knew rather than what she feared, and beneath it all, something quieter, something that doesn't always make it into the retelling, but that matters more than any of the dramatic details. She had not stopped believing in herself. Even when she found out that her career had been partly constructed by someone who was using her, even when she found out that her home had been violated, even when she found out that her husband had been keeping a secret that changed the shape of everything she thought she knew, even then, she had not turned that information into a reason to doubt her own worth. Because the fact that Tobena had invested in her career, even for his own reasons, said something true about her value that did not disappear just because his motives were corrupt. And the fact that Chukwuemeka had chosen wrong, even out of fear, even with mixed intentions, did not cancel the years of genuine partnership that existed alongside his mistake. She had held all of it at once, the betrayal and the love, the anger and the analysis, the grief and the strategy. She had not needed to flatten any of it into something simpler to survive it.
That, Ngozi would say to anyone who asked, was the most remarkable thing. Not what she did, not the investigation, not the submission, not the careful 2-week gathering of evidence. All of that was impressive. All of that took courage and intelligence. But what it took to do all of that while still feeling it, while still sitting with the full weight of what had happened to her, without shutting down, without going numb, without turning herself into a machine to get through it, that was something else entirely. That was strength that had no name for it. Obiageli Nwosu is still in Port Harcourt. Her consulting practice has grown. She and Chukwuemeka are still married, and by all accounts, they are telling each other the truth in a way they were not telling it before. They still don't have children. The quiet ache is still there. But she has said, in the rare moments when she speaks about it, that she and Chukwuemeka are more present to each other now than they have ever been. The crisis stripped away a lot of the comfortable distance that couples accumulate over years, the polite half-attentions and the things left unsaid, and what it left behind was two people who had looked directly at each other in very unflattering circumstances and chosen to stay in the room. Tobena Okafor's case is still working its way through the legal system in the particular slow, grinding way that financial cases do in Nigeria. The outcome is not yet certain, but the accounts are frozen, the evidence is documented, and the people he had gathered under his control have told their stories. Some victories are immediate, some take longer. Obi has learned the difference. She keeps the 6-word notes, the one she left in Chukwuemeka's briefcase. She found it in the back of his drawer one afternoon when she was reorganizing. He had kept it. I know you are in trouble. Talk. She held it for a long time, reading the 6 words that had changed the trajectory of everything. Then she put it back exactly where she found it. She figured he would want to keep it. She understood why. If this story reached you, if you watched to this point, then you already know what kind of person you are.
You are the kind of person who stays, who wants to understand, who doesn't need the quick, easy answer. You are willing to sit with the full complexity of a thing and let it teach you something. That's the kind of person Obiageli was, and look what it gave her. If there's a lesson here, and there's always a lesson in a story this real, it is this. The people who underestimate you are always wrong, but they will never tell you they're wrong. You have to show them. Not for them, for yourself. And when the moment comes, and it always comes, don't react before you understand. The reaction can wait, the understanding cannot. If this story moved you, if it gave you something, share it with someone who needs it tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this channel tells the stories that matter. The ones that are true, even when they are complicated. The ones that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Obiageli left Nigeria talking. Now you carry part of her story. Make it matter.